The road into Hollow Creek twisted like a serpent, coiling deeper into the belly of Kentucky's forgotten hills. The air grew thicker with every mile, heavy with the scent of rot and something sweeter, something human. Locals called it the scent of old blood. By the time the first cabin roofs appeared through the mist, the sun had already begun to die behind the ridges, and the shadows seemed to breathe. He had come searching for a story, the kind that lives between rumor and nightmare. For decades, people whispered about the Wickers women, said to be the most inbred bloodline in the state, kept hidden in the dense woods outside town. They were said to be pale as wax, with eyes too large for their faces and a strange, almost animal intelligence. No doctor had treated them, no preacher had buried them. They were ghosts that walked in daylight, descendants of a sin no one dared name aloud. The townsfolk avoided the hollow. They said the Wickers women could smell outsiders, that they'd lure men into the woods and never let them leave the same. Every few years, hunters disappeared, sometimes only their boots were found, sitting neatly at the edge of the tree line, as if placed there by careful, delicate hands. When the journalist parked his truck beside the rusted private road sign, the world seemed to go silent, no wind, no birds, only the faint drip of water from somewhere unseen. A crow perched on a fence post, watching him with human stillness. Beyond that, the forest waited, dark and ancient, holding its breath. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he stepped into those woods, his story stopped belonging to him. The Wickers had been waiting. The blood had been waiting. And in the silence of Hollow Creek, where even the trees seemed to whisper, the most inbred women of Kentucky were ready to welcome him home. The arrival of the outsider began with the sound of gravel crunching beneath worn tires as a lone pickup truck made its slow way through the winding, neglected roads of rural Kentucky. The man behind the wheel, a journalist named Daniel Ward, had driven hundreds of miles from Chicago, chasing a story that most editors dismissed as folklore. To him, the tale of the Wickers family wasn't just a rumor, it was a challenge, the kind of truth buried beneath generations of silence and shame. The deeper he drove into the hills, the more the landscape seemed to close around him. Trees leaned over the road like eavesdropping sentinels, and the sky turned from gray to a bruised purple, thick with an uneasy stillness. There was no radio signal, no cell service, only the steady hum of his engine and the faint rattle of something loose in the truck bed. Daniel had first heard about the Wickers women from an old newspaper clipping an obituary that listed no cause of death, no family, no photograph. Just a name, Mara Wickers, and a date that seemed too recent for such a forgotten place. When he began to ask questions, small-town clerks had grown quiet, eyes darting toward the door, as if the name itself carried a curse. "Don't go digging in that hollow," one of them had warned. "That family don't take kindly to strangers." But Daniel thrived on resistance. He'd built his career on unearthing the stories others feared to touch, the ones that blurred the line between horror and history. As he reached the first sign of habitation, a sagging barn, a mailbox crushed under a fallen branch, he felt that peculiar sensation of being watched. There was no movement, yet he could sense eyes tracking him from behind the curtains of those distant, rotting houses. He parked his truck near the edge of a hollow road, where the map showed nothing but blank space, and stepped out into air so still it felt heavy against his skin. The smell hit him first, a sickly sweetness mixed with the damp scent of decay, as though the land itself had begun to rot from within. He jotted a note in his weathered leather journal, marking the time and location, a habit from years in the field. Yet as he looked up, he realized something strange. There were no sounds of life, not even the rustle of insects. Only the faint whistle of wind through the trees that seemed to mimic a voice, whispering words he couldn't quite make out. Somewhere beyond that silence, he thought he saw a figure, small, still, and white against the darkening trees, but when he blinked, it was gone. Daniel's pulse quickened. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew the story had already found him before he could find it. The whispers in the hollow began long before Daniel arrived, carried through generations like a sickness that no one dared name. The people of Hollow Creek had learned to speak of the Wickers family only in low tones, as if even their names could summon something from the woods. When Daniel walked into the town's only diner on his first morning, the air shifted. Conversations stopped, spoons clinked against coffee cups, and every set of eyes turned toward him with a wary recognition that he didn't understand. He introduced himself politely, ordered black coffee, and mentioned he was writing a piece on Kentucky's forgotten families. The waitress, a gray-haired woman with trembling hands, froze mid-pour. After a moment of uneasy silence, she leaned in close enough for him to smell the cigarette smoke clinging to her uniform and whispered, "You don't want to be asking about the Wickers." Daniel pressed anyway, his curiosity overcoming caution. The woman's face hardened, her eyes darting toward the fogged-up windows where the forest loomed just beyond town. "They don't come here no more," she said. "Not since that night. But sometimes, we still hear them. Laughing. Crying. Calling for someone who ain't there." Before he could ask what night she meant, the cook banged on the counter and muttered something about outsiders stirring up ghosts. Daniel paid and left, but not before noticing that one of the older men at the bar was tracing something into the condensation on his glass, 3 crude letters, WWM. As he walked down the main street, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching him from every doorway. A teenage boy sweeping the porch of a closed store suddenly stopped and said, "If you're going up that way, take salt." When Daniel asked why, the boy just shrugged. "They don't cross salt." The words lingered with him as he drove closer to the hollow that afternoon. Even the road signs seemed to vanish the deeper he went, replaced by weathered posts marked with symbols carved into the wood, circles, crosses, and strange twisting lines like roots. By the time the sun dipped low, the world had gone quiet again. He stopped his truck near the edge of a bridge where a creek cut through the trees, and for a moment, he thought he heard laughter, soft, echoing, and distant. It wasn't the laughter of joy, but something hollow and broken. Then came a voice, barely audible yet unmistakably feminine, whispering his name as if she already knew him. The hair on his arms rose as he looked into the thick fog curling above the water, trying to convince himself that what he heard was nothing more than wind. But deep down, something in that sound told him he wasn't alone anymore, and that the hollow itself was alive and waiting. The day Daniel captured the photograph was the first time he felt the hollow watching back. He had been wandering for hours through the dense woods beyond the creek, his camera slung around. Daniel hesitated before stepping inside. The door was swollen shut from years of rain, but it gave way with a groan that seemed almost like a warning. The air inside was cold, stale, and thick with the scent of mold and something faintly metallic. Light filtered through the cracks in the wood, cutting thin beams across the dusty floor. It was clear no one had lived there for decades, yet there was a strange order to the disarray: a rocking chair facing the window, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of a bed, jars of cloudy liquid lined on a shelf. The silence felt unnatural, like the house itself was listening. As Daniel raised his flashlight, he saw something that stopped him cold. On every wall, in uneven patterns, were carvings, hundreds of them. Children's drawings etched into the wood with something sharp. At first, they seemed innocent, stick figures, houses, trees. But the longer he looked, the darker they became. The faces grew distorted, the smiles wider, the eyes hollow and blackened. Nearly every drawing centered on the same figure: a tall woman with hair that reached her waist, her hands drawn disproportionately long, her eyes wide and staring. Sometimes she was standing among children. Sometimes she stood alone, her mouth open in what might have been a scream or a song. Daniel's breath caught as he noticed a fresh carving beneath the window, the lines still raw against the wood. It was the same woman, only this time she was holding something, a small shape that looked like a camera. He took a step back, his pulse racing, and the floorboards creaked beneath him. Somewhere above, something shifted, a soft dragging sound that came from the attic. He looked up toward the ceiling, his flashlight trembling in his hand, and for a brief second, he thought he heard a whisper, a child's voice, faint and distant, murmuring the same 3 words over and over, though he couldn't understand what they meant. Beneath the warped floorboards of the cabin, Daniel uncovered what would become the most disturbing piece of evidence he had ever found. He had been pacing the room, recording notes on his phone, when his boot sank slightly into one of the boards near the bed. Curious, he knelt down and brushed away a layer of dust, revealing a loose plank with deep gouges along its edges, as if someone had pried it open many times before. Using his pocket knife, he lifted it carefully, and a cloud of stale air rose up carrying the scent of mildew and something older, something dry and faintly coppery. Inside the narrow space beneath, wrapped in a sheet of yellowed cloth, was a large leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked and mottled with age, but the gold lettering was still visible beneath the grime, the Holy Bible. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, but when Daniel opened it, he realized this was no Bible. The pages had been altered, the original scripture scraped away and overwritten by hand in fading black ink. It was not written like a diary but more like a record, meticulous, deliberate, and cold. Each page listed names, followed by dates and short, cryptic notes. But as he read deeper, the pattern became clear. Each name was paired with another, often the same surname, sometimes identical first names appearing generation after generation. The word union appeared repeatedly, followed by the phrase complete scrawled beside it. Whole branches of the family tree were crossed out, rewritten, and merged again in tangled patterns that defied logic. Some names were circled in red ink, others violently scratched over as though the writer had changed their mind about who should be remembered. One page near the center made Daniel's stomach twist. At the top, written in larger letters, were the words "The Blood Ledger." Beneath it, a long line of women's names, each marked with a small cross, trailed down the page. Many bore the surname Wickers, though a few had none at all, as if their existence had been deliberately erased. In the margins, someone had written phrases in trembling handwriting: "Pure line, chosen by the matriarch, and the seed returns to the source." Daniel turned another page and froze. There, at the bottom of the last entry, was a date from less than 10 years ago, followed by an unfinished name, the ink smeared as though the writer had been interrupted. A chill ran through him as he realized that what lay before him wasn't just a record of births and deaths, it was a manifesto of obsession. This wasn't about faith or heritage, it was about control, about a family that had rewritten its own bloodline until it no longer resembled humanity at all. He felt the weight of the ledger in his hands, heavy as if it carried not just history, but every sin ever buried in the hollow. It was near dusk when Daniel met her, the woman who would finally give voice to the whispers that haunted Hollow Creek. The sun was sinking low, spilling a rust-colored light over the trees, and the woods seemed to hum with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Daniel had gone back to the cabin, unable to shake the feeling that something in that place was unfinished, that the story was still watching him. He was standing outside, staring at the hollow door, when he heard the crunch of leaves behind him. He turned sharply, expecting an animal, but instead saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. She was tall and thin, her face half hidden beneath a curtain of tangled hair that shimmered pale in the fading light. Her dress was old-fashioned, yellowed with age, and her bare feet were streaked with dirt. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Daniel felt an inexplicable pull, as if he were looking at someone familiar, though he knew he had never seen her before. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, cracked, but deliberate, every word carrying a strange rhythm. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "The blood doesn't forget." Her eyes, impossibly pale, reflected what little light remained, almost glowing. Daniel took a cautious step forward, asking if she was a Wickers, if she knew anything about the family that once lived there. The woman tilted her head slightly, and for a moment, her expression softened. "I was," she whispered. "Once. Before they buried us in ourselves." Her words sent a shiver through him. She walked past him slowly, her movements fragile yet purposeful, and ran her hand along the side of the cabin as if she could still feel something alive beneath the rotting wood. "They called it purity," she continued. "But it was just hunger, the kind that never dies." She told him she was the last daughter, the one who had escaped before the matriarch found her. She said the others still lingered in the hollow, bound not by life but by the blood that had been forced to fold in on itself. When Daniel asked what had happened to the rest of her family, she turned to him with an expression so hollow it barely seemed human. "They became the roots," she said. "And the roots never let go." Before he could speak again, she stepped back into the shadows of the trees. "You need to leave," she said. "Before the blood calls you in." Her voice seemed to echo without her lips moving, fading into the woods like smoke. Then she was gone, swallowed by the dusk, leaving behind only the faint imprint of her footsteps in the dirt. Daniel stood frozen, heart hammering, her words repeating in his head not as a warning, but as a promise that whatever curse had held the Wickers would not rest with their blood alone. Daniel followed her warning, at least for a while, but curiosity is a curse all its own. A few days after his encounter with the last Wicker's daughter, He returned to the hollow with a single purpose: to find where she had come from. Her mention of roots and burial had haunted him, circling in his mind like an unfinished sentence. The forest felt heavier now, quieter, as if the trees themselves had grown cautious of him. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and decay. A fine mist clung to the ground, and the deeper he went, the more the land seemed to sag beneath his boots, until he reached a clearing that felt deliberately hidden, as though the world itself had tried to erase it. There, among twisted oaks and wild vines, lay a field of unmarked graves. The earth was uneven, disturbed, covered in moss that grew over wooden crosses long since rotted away. Some mounds were small, others large, and most bore no name at all. But a few stones still stood upright, carved crudely with first names: Anna, Ruth, Mara, Ellen, and nothing else. Daniel crouched to touch one of the stones, and as his fingers brushed the weathered surface, he noticed something strange. The names had been carved over older ones, faint and nearly invisible, as if each generation had simply buried the last and reused their resting places. It was a graveyard of repetition, a cycle carved into the earth itself. He began to walk through the rows, counting the graves, when he noticed several patches of freshly turned soil. The ground looked too loose, too new, and the scent that rose from it was wrong, a mix of dampness and something iron-heavy. He knelt and brushed the dirt aside, revealing fabric that looked like part of a dress. His breath caught. The cloth was pale and frayed, but beneath it, he could see the outline of a human hand, small and colorless, almost blending with the soil. He stumbled back, his pulse pounding, staring at the mound as if it might move. Then he saw the symbols. Around some of the newer graves, small stones had been arranged in patterns, circles intersected with crooked lines that matched the markings he had seen carved on the trees near the road. They weren't random, they were deliberate, ritualistic. The realization hit him like a cold wave. These graves weren't just memorials, they were markers, seals, perhaps even prisons for something that refused to stay buried. A faint sound drifted from somewhere behind him, low and rhythmic, like humming. Daniel turned, but no one was there. Only the wind moved through the hollow, carrying the faintest whisper of a woman's voice, the same one that had warned him before, repeating his name, slower this time, as if the graves themselves had learned to speak. The return of the matriarch was not something Daniel had expected, though in retrospect, it seemed inevitable. He had pieced together fragments of the Wickers' history, met the last daughter, and traced the hidden graves, but he had not yet encountered the force that had bound the family together for generations. That evening, as the sky bled into orange and violet behind the ridges, he sensed a shift in the hollow, a presence heavier than the forest itself, deliberate and oppressive. The trees no longer seemed neutral. They leaned inward, forming a natural barrier around him, and the wind carried a faint, metallic scent that made his stomach tighten. He had returned to the cabin, notebook and camera at the ready, feeling a mixture of dread and fascination that had long ago crossed the line from journalistic curiosity into personal obsession. As he stepped inside, the air felt different, charged, almost electric. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, and the carvings on the walls seemed to move subtly, as if the images were aware of him. Then he heard the creak of the attic ladder. At first, he thought it was another trick of the old wood, but it repeated, deliberate and slow, as if someone or something was descending. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he swept the beam upward, and there she was. She did not walk down the ladder in the way a normal person might. She seemed to glide, her movements fluid and unnerving, with long fingers that touched nothing yet left the air seeming heavier in her wake. The woman who emerged was older, her hair streaked with grey but otherwise pale and unyielding, her eyes sharp and commanding. The matriarch, he realized, had never truly left. She had been watching, waiting in the shadows, pulling the strings of her family's twisted lineage. She spoke without preamble, her voice low and melodic, carrying both menace and authority. "You see what they have become," she said, her gaze sweeping the cabin as though she could read every thought he had ever had. Daniel could not look away, compelled by the unnatural power she exuded. All of this, every life, every union, every sacrifice, it exists because I willed it. The blood is my instrument, and I am its master. Her words were calm, matter-of-fact, but they carried the weight of centuries. She told him that the women he had glimpsed, the graves he had uncovered, even the daughter who had warned him, they all answered to her. They were bound not by fear alone but by a design so complete it had been hidden from the world, preserved in silence, in secrecy, in every repetition of the bloodline. As she approached, Daniel realized that her presence was suffocating yet magnetic. The cabin itself seemed to bend toward her will, the shadows thickening where she passed. He understood then that the Wickers women had never truly been free, that their lives were dictated from the darkness beyond the walls. The matriarch's influence extended far beyond memory, far beyond her visible form, reaching into the very fabric of the hollow itself, and Daniel felt the terrifying truth settle in his chest. He was now part of a story controlled by someone who had long since erased the line between life, death, and obsession. The inbred prophecy was whispered to Daniel in fragments, each word more unnerving than the last, written in the edges of the ledger and carried in the voice of the last Wicker's daughter. It began as a curiosity, a note tucked into the margins of the blood ledger he had discovered beneath the cabin's floorboards, almost hidden beneath generations of names and unions. The handwriting was jagged, deliberate, and uneven, as if written by someone both hurried and obsessed, but the meaning was unmistakable. The matriarch had not merely overseen the family, she had dictated its future. Each marriage, each birth, each repetition of the bloodline was guided by a strict design. The prophecy claimed that the Wicker's purity must continue until the last daughter bore a child with her own reflection, a phrase so chilling that Daniel could not decipher whether it was literal or symbolic. As he read further, the prophecy revealed that every woman of the family was both a vessel and a prisoner. Their lives were predestined, measured, and recorded in meticulous detail. Names were chosen not for love or tradition but for continuity. Dates were chosen not for convenience but for alignment with rituals long forgotten by the outside world. Each generation was to reproduce within the family, perpetuating what the matriarch called the pure line. The ledger made it clear that deviation was forbidden and that any attempt to escape or alter the cycle was met with swift and invisible correction. It was a system that had persisted for decades, one that relied not only on secrecy but on fear, manipulation, and a legacy of obedience carved into the very bones of the Wickers women. The prophecy was not idle superstition. As Daniel studied the ledger and cross-referenced it with the graves in the hollow, he began to see the pattern: women disappearing, marriages repeated across generations, children born in secrecy, buried if they threatened the design. There were notes of warning, brief messages in the margins that spoke of punishment and ritual, of the consequences of straying from the ordained path. The matriarch had codified every aspect of her control, leaving behind a blueprint for domination that extended beyond death. The words of the prophecy haunted him as he wandered the hollow. The last daughter's warning echoed in his ears: the blood would call him in. He realized that the matriarch had not merely documented the family's past, she had prepared for its future, ensuring that no outsider, no matter how curious, could disrupt the cycle. The ledger and the prophecy were intertwined, a roadmap of obsession that extended into the present, and Daniel felt the weight of its inevitability pressing down on him. Every footstep through the graves, every glance at the forest, made it clear that the prophecy was active, alive, and waiting for the next moment of fulfillment. The final descent began with a creeping awareness that Daniel was no longer just an observer in Hollow Creek, but a participant in a story that had been written long before he arrived. After days of tracing the Wickers' history, walking among unmarked graves, and piecing together the blood ledger, he realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the matriarch's control extended beyond the living. The forest, the cabin, the hollow itself, everything was a mechanism designed to pull outsiders into the family's cycle, to trap them in a web spun from obsession, secrecy, and generations of incestuous lineage. Each clue he uncovered, each warning he had brushed aside, had been a step toward the inevitable. It began subtly. At first, he noticed that familiar paths seemed to loop back on themselves. Every time he thought he was moving forward, the same trees, the same twisted roots, appeared in his line of sight, as if the hollow had rearranged itself around him. His journal entries seemed to echo one another, phrases repeated despite his memory insisting he hadn't written them. Even the photographs he had taken of trees, cabins, and the last daughter herself began to distort when he reviewed them, the images warping, the figures bending in impossible ways. It was as though the forest, and perhaps the family itself, were marking him, bending reality to ensure he could not leave unchanged. Then came the whispers. Not the distant, fleeting sounds he had heard at first, but voices unmistakably close, speaking his name in tones both soft and commanding. They called to him from the shadows, rising and falling like a chant, layered over the rustling of leaves and the creak of rotting wood. When he tried to respond, the words lodged in his throat. He realized, with growing terror, that these were not merely warnings but summonses. He was being drawn into the very pattern that had enslaved the Wickers women for generations. As night fell, Daniel found himself at the edge of the hollow, near the oldest, most worn grave, the one where the matriarch's presence had been most strongly felt. The air felt thick, almost liquid, and the shadows coalesced into shapes that moved with purpose. And then he saw it, a figure in the distance, pale and still, watching him. The ledger's warning and the last daughter's words returned in full clarity. The blood calls, and it does not wait. His name, he suddenly understood, had been written long before he set foot in the hollow, scratched into the margins of the family's obsession as the next union, the next fulfillment of the prophecy. There was no escape. The trees, the graves, the wind itself seemed to close around him, and the realization struck with unbearable force. Daniel's story had ended the moment he arrived, and the Wickers' dark legacy would claim him as it had claimed every outsider who ventured too close.